Have you ever caught yourself in one of those quiet moments when everything inside you seems too tired to go on, but at the same time there's something inexplicable that refuses to give up? As if there were an invisible battle going on inside your soul, where one part of you wants to stop now, while another insists, even without strength, on taking just one more step. This type of conflict does not make noise, no one sees, no one notices, but it weighs. It weighs as if time slows down and each thought begins to echo louder than it should. And it is precisely in these moments, when the mind is filled with doubts and the heart seems to lose its rhythm, that many begin to believe that perhaps the end is closer than the new beginning. But what if I told you that there is something going on behind this fatigue that you still haven't been able to see? Something silent, almost imperceptible, that acts while you think everything is still. A kind of hidden direction, a spiritual key that has always been there, but that few can really perceive. It's not something far away nor complicated, but it's also not obvious to those who look only with their natural eyes. There is a pattern, a hidden path between the lines of what you live today, and it explains why, even when all seems lost, there is still this restlessness inside you that does not let you stop. Because the truth is that there is a way out, but it doesn't show up the way you expect. She doesn't scream, she doesn't force, she doesn't invade, she reveals herself. And when it is revealed, everything changes. What once seemed like weight begins to make sense. What seemed like backwardness begins to show purpose. There is an ancient and powerful spiritual code hidden in teachings that many have heard, but few have actually applied. And it is exactly this code that separates those who give up along the way from those who live what God has already prepared. Today, you are not here by chance. There is something that needs to be seen, understood, and above all, lived. And as you keep going, something inside of you will start to align in a way that you may not have felt in a long time. Because this isn't just about listening. It's about noticing something that can completely change the way you face everything from now on. At this moment, you will begin to realize that nothing you are experiencing is random. Throughout this journey, spiritual principles hidden in Scripture will be revealed that show how God works in silence, sustaining, strengthening, and guiding, even when everything seems confusing. Each part was prepared to touch deep areas of your life, bringing direction, renewing your faith, and awakening a strength that you may not even know still existed. As you continue, something inside you begins to line up, as if every word is an answer you need to hear right now. Isaiah 40:31 says, "But those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength." And that's exactly what starts to happen here. And if this message is already speaking to you, enjoy this video, subscribe to the channel, and allow this word to reach other lives that also need to find hope. And it is exactly at this point that many are confused, because when everything seems silent, when the answers do not come, and when the path does not open, the feeling is of abandonment. But what seems empty may actually be the most crowded place of God's presence. The desert is not an accident on your journey, it is a prepared environment. A space where God begins to remove everything that distracts, everything that weakens, everything that prevents you from hearing clearly. It was like that with Moses. Before liberating an entire nation, he had to spend 40 years in a place where no one applauded, where no one recognized, where seemingly nothing happened. And perhaps this is one of the hardest parts to accept. God works hard when it seems like he's doing nothing, because it is in the invisible that he builds what the visible does not sustain alone. While you look outside and see delay, God is looking inside and generating structure. While you feel that you are standing still, God is adjusting details that will sustain what is yet to come. And that's why leaving the process before the time can be costly, because what is not dealt with in the desert appears later, at the moment when you most need to be firm. There is something profound happening when you continue without even understanding. There is a strength being generated when you decide not to give up even without seeing results. Because the desert reveals who you are when there is no incentive, when there is no answer, when there is no sign. It is there that faith ceases to be a word and becomes a decision. It is there that dependence ceases to be a theory and becomes a real necessity. Exodus 3:12 brings a powerful key when God says, "Surely I will be with you." Realize that this promise came before the miracle, before the deliverance, before any visible change. This means that God's presence is not a consequence of the result. It is the basis for the result to happen. And when you understand this, something changes within you, because you stop depending on what you see and start to stand on what God has already said. The desert is not the end of your story. It is the place where your identity is being formed. It's where God teaches you to stay, to trust, to keep going even when everything inside you wants to stop. Because those who learn to stand in silence will also know how to stand firm in the storm. And maybe, without realizing it, you're right in that place right now, being prepared for something that He cannot yet see. If this message is touching you in a different way, as if it were describing exactly what you are experiencing, do not ignore it. It may be that today is the day when something begins to change inside. If you felt this touch, write in the comments, Amen, because sometimes a simple answer is already the first step to get out of the place where you are. And when you start to stay even in this silent process, something inevitable happens at some point in the walk. Everything around you seems to collapse all at once. It's no longer just silence. It's no longer just waiting. It is as if what was still standing began to fall, as if the little stability that was left was torn away without warning. And it is exactly in this type of scenario that the story of Job ceases to be just an ancient account and becomes an uncomfortable mirror of what many people live today. Job didn't miss a single thing. He lost everything: family, goods, security, health, and along with that, any sense of control. And perhaps the hardest thing was not just the loss itself, but the fact that none of it made sense. Because when pain has an explanation, it seems more bearable. But when there is no answer, when there is no logic, when there is no apparent reason, that's where faith is really tested. And it is at this point that many give up, not for lack of strength, but for lack of understanding. But Job reveals something that completely changes this perspective. Even in the midst of chaos, even without answers, even surrounded by pain, he declared something that goes beyond emotion. It goes beyond logic. In Job 1:21 it is written, "The Lord gave and the Lord took. Blessed be the name of the Lord." That was not conformism. That was positioning. It was a conscious decision not to sever his connection to God, even when everything within him might justify otherwise. And perhaps here is one of the most difficult truths to accept. True faith is not born when everything is fine. It reveals itself when everything is falling apart, because it is easy to trust when there is stability, when there is a response, when there is a signal. But when everything is missing, when everything fails, when everything seems lost, abiding becomes a powerful spiritual act. It's not about feeling like it, it's about deciding to continue. God did not ignore Job's pain, just as He does not ignore His own. But He allowed that scenario to reveal a level of relationship that would not be possible in times of comfort. Because there are dimensions of faith that are only accessed in the midst of chaos. There are levels of trust that are only formed when there is nothing left to hold on to. And if you look sincerely at what you are experiencing, you may realize that this pressure you feel is not the end. It is a point of revelation. It is where God begins to show who really trusts, who really stays, who really decides not to give up. And if that word is awakening something inside you, as if it were a call to stand firm, even if you don't understand, write in the comments, "Speak, Lord, your servant hears," and leave your like, because that can take that same strength to someone who is about to give up. And after going through moments when everything seems to fall apart, there is a kind of silence that reaches even deeper. A silence that does not come from outside, but from within. It's as if suddenly that strength that supported you begins to weaken, and even what used to make sense no longer responds in the same way. It was exactly in this place that Elijah found himself. A man who had seen extraordinary miracles, who had faced crowds, who had already tasted the power of God unquestionably. But that, at a certain point, he found himself empty, tired, and willing to stop everything. This breaks a very common idea that only the weak go through this type of burnout. No, even those who walk with God at deep levels face moments when the soul no longer seems to keep pace with faith. Elijah went so far as to ask for his own life to end, not because he no longer believed, but because he could no longer support the weight of what he was feeling. And maybe, somehow, you understand this kind of tiredness, one that is not physical, but spiritual, emotional, silent. But this is where something powerful happens. God did not answer Elijah with spectacle. There was no grandiose demonstration. There was nothing that drew attention through the eyes. First came the strong wind, then the earthquake, then the fire. And God was not in any of them. Until, after all this, something almost imperceptible came. 1 Kings 19:12 says, "And after the fire, a still small voice." And it was there that God spoke. This completely changes the way we understand God's presence, because many times in the midst of pain, people expect something big, something immediate, something that interrupts everything at once. But God, for the most part, chooses the path of gentleness. He doesn't scream to be heard. He whispers. And he can only listen to those who decide to stay, those who decide to quiet their hearts, those who decide not to run away from silence. The problem is that many people give up before that moment. He gives up because he thinks that silence is empty, when in fact it is an invitation to a level of intimacy that cannot be accessed in the noise. God adjusts not only what you live, but how you listen. Because when you learn to recognize that soft voice, everything changes. The leadership comes, peace returns, strength is reborn. Not from the outside in, but from the inside out. And maybe, if you're living this kind of silence right now, it's not absence. May God be calling you closer. If this makes sense in your heart, simply and sincerely, write in the comments, "I believe." Sometimes a small expression of faith makes room for something much bigger to start happening within you. And it is precisely after learning to recognize this small voice that a new challenge arises. Because listening to God is one thing, but trusting to the point of taking a step is quite another. And it is here that Pedro's story connects directly with what many live today. Because there are times when you feel that God is calling you to something bigger, something out of the ordinary, something that doesn't make sense to outsiders. But at the same time, there's a fear trying to keep you right where you are. Pedro was inside the boat, in an apparently safe place, surrounded by others who were also observing the situation. But when Jesus said just one word, "Come," something inside him answered, and in that instant he did what no one else had the courage to do. He left. He stepped where there was no ground. He walked on that which would naturally make him sink. Matthew 14:29-30 says, "And he said, 'Come.' And Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water to come to Jesus. But when he felt the strong wind, he was afraid. And it is exactly in this detail that the key lies. While Peter's gaze was on Jesus, the impossible happened. But the moment he changed his focus, when he started to pay more attention to the wind, the strength of the circumstances, the risk around, fear has entered. And fear doesn't need much to act, it just needs a loophole. And when he enters, he doesn't push at once, he paralyzes little by little. Peter did not sink because the wind increased, he began to sink because the focus changed. And maybe that explains a lot in your life today. It's not that the problems are too big, it's just that, without realizing it, they're occupying more space than they should inside your mind. God never promised the absence of wind, never promised that the path would be calm all the time. But he has shown through this story that the wind has no power over those who keep their eyes in the right direction. The most interesting thing is that the moment when Peter begins to sink is not treated as a failure, but as part of the process. Because Jesus doesn't leave him there, he reaches out. This shows that God does not expect perfection. He expects you to continue even when you falter, even when you are afraid. The problem was never feeling. The problem is stopping because of it. Faith does not eliminate fear, but it prevents it from deciding its destiny. And the secret has never been to never make mistakes, but to always know where to turn your gaze when you realize you're getting lost. Because as long as you can still look at him, there is still a way, there is still support, there is still an answer. If you're here so far, it's no accident. There is something being lined up within you, something that God is adjusting as you listen to each word. And in the end, we will live a very special moment of prayer, where all this will cease to be just understanding and will become real strength within you. So stay until the end, because that may be the moment that will mark a new beginning in your journey, and as you begin to understand that fear cannot define your steps, another pain arises that is even more difficult to deal with. The one that does not come from circumstances, but from people. Because facing the wind is one thing, but dealing with betrayal, injustice, and abandonment is something that reaches much deeper. And it is exactly in this type of scenario that Jose's story becomes impossible to ignore, because he wasn't attacked by distant enemies. He was wounded by those who were closest. Joseph had God-given dreams, clear promises about his future, but the path to that destination was completely different from what he could have imagined. He was rejected by his own brothers, sold into slavery, taken to a strange land, unjustly accused and thrown into prison. And in none of these moments were there signs that anything was working. On the contrary, everything seemed to indicate that his life was being destroyed little by little. And perhaps this is one of the greatest tests of faith. When what you are experiencing does not match what God has promised you, when the present seems to completely contradict the future you believed in. This is where many give up, because they can't connect the current pain with a greater purpose. But Joseph reveals something powerful. He didn't allow the process to change who he was. Even as a slave, he was faithful. Even wronged, he remained upright. Even forgotten in prison, he did not abandon his trust in God. This shows that the purpose is not cancelled by the process, it is shaped by it. Each difficult phase that Jose faced was not a delay, it was a preparation. Each injustice was an invisible step that brought him closer to the place where God wanted to place him. And years later, when everything finally revealed itself, when he was in a position of authority, when he had the power to take revenge, he released one of the strongest statements in the entire Bible. Genesis 50:20 says, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." That changes everything, because it shows that what looked like destruction was being used as construction. What seemed like loss was being transformed into a path. God wastes nothing. Not the pain, not the injustice, not the moments when you felt forgotten. Everything is being worked on in a way that you may not be able to see yet, but that at the right time will make sense. And to give up in the middle of all this is to never allow this transformation to be completed. Maybe you're experiencing something you don't understand, something that seems unfair, something that made you question everything. But that doesn't mean the purpose is over. It can be just the opposite. It could be the process positioning you for something bigger than you think right now. If that word spoke to you directly, as if describing exactly what you're experiencing, state in the comments, "Lord, I receive your teachings." Write this as an act of faith, and leave your like, because this message can reach someone who also needs to understand that God is still in control of everything. And after understanding that even pain and injustice are part of a larger process, another silent test arises that few can bear: time. Because it is not enough to receive a promise, the real challenge begins when it takes time to be fulfilled. And it is here that David's story reveals something profoundly real about walking with God. He was anointed king, chosen before all, set apart for a great destiny, but soon after that nothing changed on the outside. 1 Samuel 16:13 says, "And from that day forward, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David. The anointing came, the confirmation came, the presence of God came, but the throne did not." And it is exactly this interval that confuses so many people, because there is an expectation that when God promises something, everything must happen quickly. But with David it was different. He went back to the field, he went back to tending sheep, he went back to a routine that didn't seem to match what he had been given. And as if the wait wasn't enough, the chases came. David began to be hunted, threatened, rejected by the one who occupied the place that would one day be his. This shows that the promise does not exempt you from battles, it prepares you for them. The time between the call and the fulfillment is not a delay, it is a construction. It is during this period that God works on the character, adjusts intentions, strengthens the heart, and teaches to depend completely on him. Because imagine if David had taken the throne immediately, without going through that process. He might have a position, but he would not have the structure to sustain what God wanted to do through him. And this is exactly what often happens. People want to live the promise, but they do not want to go through the path that forms the maturity necessary to sustain it. God does not work in a hurry. He works with precision. Each stage has a purpose. Each phase carries a learning that will be necessary later on. And when you understand this, waiting is no longer a burden and becomes an alignment. Because it's not just about arriving, it's about being ready when you arrive. David did not give up in the time of waiting. He remained faithful, he remained obedient, he continued to trust, even without seeing the promise immediately fulfilled. And this is what separates those who live the purpose from those who stop along the way. The promise is only the beginning, not the end. What you do between inception and realization defines everything. And maybe you're right in that space right now, between what God has shown you and what has not yet happened. And the question that remains is, will you stay or will you stop? Because time may seem long, but it is never empty when God is in control. If this message found you at that moment, as if it were a silent confirmation of something you were already feeling, then don't ignore it. When you like, subscribe, and activate the bell, that word reaches other people who are also waiting and need to understand that God has not been late. Be a part of it, because a simple action can bring hope to someone who is about to give up. And it is in this space between waiting and fulfillment that a decision arises that changes everything. To continue trying or to accept the condition as definitive. Because, after so long of fighting, after so many failed attempts, there is a quiet tendency to get used to the pain. And that's exactly where this woman's story begins to speak in a deep way to those who have already felt limited by their own reality. She didn't just face a physical ailment, she carried years of rejection, isolation, and emotional exhaustion. 12 years of living in a situation that drained his strength, his resources, and his hope. And the hardest thing was not just the pain, it was the repetition of it. It was waking up every day and realizing that nothing changed. Maybe you understand that. not as something momentary, but as something that seems to have no end. But at some point, something inside her refused to accept that condition as her final destination. Even with all the limitations imposed by society, even with the weakened body, even with everything saying that it was no longer worth trying, she made a quiet but extremely powerful decision. Mark 5:28 says, "For he said, 'If I only touch your garments, I will be healed.'" Notice that before any physical movement, there was an internal decision. She decided to believe again. And that changes everything, because true faith is not just about waiting for something to happen. It is about acting as if it were already possible. That woman did not stand still waiting for Jesus to come to her. She stood up. She faced the crowd. She overcame cultural barriers that said she shouldn't even be there. Every step she took was a break from everything that tried to keep her in the same place. And perhaps the most powerful thing about this story is not just the miracle that happened, but the path to it. Because the touch wasn't an accident, it was the result of a firm decision not to give up. How many people were around Jesus at that moment? Many. But only one touched it with enough faith to transform its reality. This shows that it's not about physical proximity, it's about spiritual positioning. You can be close to everything you need, but if there is no internal decision, nothing changes. That woman could have stayed at home, could have accepted her condition, could have let another day pass. But she chose to act. And when she touches Jesus, something happens immediately, not only in the body, but in the identity. Because at that moment, she was no longer known for pain and began to be recognized for faith. This reveals that the greatest miracle was not only the cure, it was the decision to break with everything that tried to define who she was. Maybe there's something in your life that's been going on for too long, something that tries to convince you that it won't change. But this story shows that all it takes is a movement, a decision, a step of faith for everything to begin to be transformed. And if, while you were listening to this, someone came to your mind, someone who needs that same strength, that same intervention from God, don't ignore it. Write that person's name in the comments. By doing so, you connect with a current of faith that believes that God still transforms stories, still heals, still responds. And this can be the beginning of something new, not only for you, but for someone you carry in your heart. And when you begin to realize that faith requires movement, that it is not enough to just believe, but to remain, another even deeper layer of this journey emerges. The ability to continue even when the pain does not go away. Because there are situations in which the miracle does not happen immediately, in which the answer does not come in the expected time, and even so, the call continues. And it is exactly at this point that Paul's life reveals one of the strongest teachings about not giving up. Paulo did not live an easy journey. He faced constant persecution, was rejected, beaten, unjustly imprisoned, and often found himself in situations where anyone would have enough reason to stop. But what stands out is not just what he faced, it's how he saw it all. Because, for him, pain was not a sign that something was wrong, but part of the path that needed to be traveled. In 2 Corinthians 4:8-9, it is written, "We are troubled in every way, but not distressed, perplexed, but not discouraged, persecuted, but not helpless, slaughtered, but not destroyed." This statement does not deny the reality of pain. It reveals a posture towards it. Paul did not pretend that everything was fine. He recognized the difficulties, but he did not allow them to define his direction. And perhaps this is one of the greatest secrets of spiritual perseverance, to understand that feeling is not the problem. The problem is allowing what you feel to determine who you become. Paul felt the weight of situations, but his identity was not in pain, it was in purpose. He knew there was something bigger sustaining every step, even when the path seemed too hard. This completely changes the way we live. Because when you understand that pain is not the end, but part of the process, you stop fighting everything that happens and start drawing strength from even the most difficult situations. True strength is not in avoiding problems, but in standing firm in spite of them. It's to keep moving forward, even when there's no applause, even when there's no recognition, even when it seems like no one is watching. Paul did not give up because he was clear about who called him. And when that clarity exists, circumstances lose their power to stop you. They can even hit you, they can even tire you, but they can't destroy you. Because there is something inside you that is bigger than all that. And perhaps today, more than ever, you need to understand this. It's not about having a life without difficulties. It's about developing a faith that remains even within them. A faith that is not easily shaken, that does not shrink in the face of pressure, that does not surrender to fatigue. None of this is easy, but it is possible. And every story you've heard so far is building within you that same strength, that same resistance, that same decision to continue. Nothing happens by chance. If you've come this far, it's because there's something God is lining up within you. Stay until the end, because there is still a moment prepared especially for you, where all this will turn into something real in your life. And after understanding that standing firm in the midst of pain is essential, an even more challenging call arises, because there are times when God doesn't just ask for resistance, it calls for movement, and not just any movement, but a step into the unknown, a step that is not accompanied by explanations, guarantees, or visible security. That is exactly what happened to Abraham. He received a promise that seemed too big for the reality he was living. God spoke about a future, about a land, about an offspring. But he did not deliver the map, he did not show the complete path, he did not explain the details, and yet Abraham decided to go. Hebrews 11:8 says, "By faith Abraham, being called, obeyed, going to a place which he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out, not knowing where he was going." And this is perhaps one of the purest expressions of faith, to leave without knowing it. Because the human mind always seeks control. They want to understand before acting. They want guarantees before trusting. They want security before taking the first step. But God works differently. He doesn't reveal everything at once, because the goal is not to give you control, it's to teach you dependence. And this directly confronts what often prevents us from moving forward. How many times have you felt like you needed more clarity to keep going? How many times did you think that if you were more sure, you would take the next step? But the truth is that understanding comes after obedience, not before. Abraham did not walk because he understood everything. He walked because he trusted the one who called him. And this completely changes the way we see the journey, because it stops being about having all the answers and becomes about being aligned with God's leading. True faith does not require detailed explanations, it requires surrender. And surrendering is not easy, because it means giving up control, giving up logic, giving up the need to know everything. But it is exactly in this space where there are no visible guarantees that the supernatural begins to happen. Because while you try to control, you limit, but when you trust, God expands. Abraham left a known, comfortable, predictable place to get into something completely new. And it was on this path that he became much more than someone who received a promise. He became the beginning of a legacy. This reveals something profound. Giving up doesn't just affect the now, it can impact everything that would still come through you. There are things that God wants to do that go beyond your own life, but that depend on your decision to continue, even if you don't fully understand it. Maybe you're facing such a moment right now, a point where God is calling you to move forward, but has not yet shown all the details. And what seems like insecurity can actually be an invitation to a deeper level of faith. because the next level will not be released through the explanation, but through trust. And after realizing that faith often requires walking without seeing, another path emerges that God uses to sustain those who are on the edge, prayer that is born of the deepest pain. Because there are times when you no longer have the strength to explain, you no longer have arguments, you no longer have elaborate words. All that remains is a sincere cry. And it is exactly in this place that Anna's story begins to touch in such a real way. Anna carried a pain that was not visible to everyone, but that consumed her soul inside. Sterility at that time was not just a physical condition, it was a reason for shame, constant humiliation, comparison, and silence. She saw other people moving forward, living what she wanted so much, while her reality seemed stuck, without answer, without change. And maybe you understand that kind of pain. When something never seems to move from its place, even after so long. But what differentiates Anna is not only the suffering she experienced, but what she did with it. She did not close herself completely. She did not harden her heart. She did not give up searching. She decided to take what was inside her to the only place where there was still hope, the presence of God. But it wasn't just any prayer. It was a deep, intense, sincere cry of those that do not come from the mouth, but from the soul. She poured herself out before God, without reservations, without masks, without trying to appear strong. And it is exactly this type of delivery that changes everything. Because God doesn't just answer words, He answers hearts that truly open. 1 Samuel 1:27 says, "I prayed for this child, and the Lord granted my petition which I had made to Him." But before this answer there was insistence, there were tears, there was perseverance. And here is one of the most powerful teachings. Prayer is not just emotional relief, it is a real channel of transformation. When everything seems closed, there is still access that no one can block. When no one understands, God understands. When no one sees, God sees. And when you decide not to give up praying, even without an immediate response, something starts to move. Anna didn't just get what she asked for, she became part of something much bigger. The son who was born of his pain became a prophet who marked generations. This reveals that what you are asking for today can have an impact that goes far beyond what you imagine. What seems personal may actually be part of a larger purpose being prepared. Perhaps what God expects is not that you stop, but that you go deeper. May you go beyond repeated words and enter a truer level of surrender. Because it is in this place that skies open, cycles are broken, and paths begin to emerge where there was nothing before. And if somehow that message has found a place within you, as if it describes exactly what your soul has been feeling in silence, don't ignore it. This did not happen by chance. If this touched your heart, she writes in the comments, "I trust in God." Sometimes a simple expression of faith is already the beginning of something being transformed within you. And after understanding that prayer opens paths where there are none, there comes a moment when it is not enough just to cry out. It is necessary to move forward, because there will be situations in which God has already spoken, has already confirmed, has already directed, but the scenario ahead continues to look impossible. And it is exactly at this point that Joshua's story reveals one of the most challenging teachings about not giving up. Joshua was given a mission that, humanly speaking, was too heavy. He took over the leadership after Moses, someone who marked an entire generation, and now he needed to lead an entire people towards a land that was occupied by giants, protected by fortified cities, and surrounded by obstacles that seemed insurmountable. It was not just a walk, it was a direct confrontation with what seemed impossible. And maybe you understand this kind of situation. When you know what you need to do, when you feel that there is a direction, But when you look ahead, everything seems too big, too difficult, too far away. And at that moment, fear tries to take over, trying to convince you that it's not worth moving forward. But God did not change the scenario for Joshua. He did not remove the giants. He did not tear down the walls before his time. He did not make the way easy. What he did was to give a word. Joshua 1:9 says, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and be of good courage. Do not be afraid nor be dismayed. For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." And that word changes everything. Because God didn't promise ease, he promised presence. Joshua's courage did not come from the absence of fear. It came from the certainty that God was ahead. This reveals something profound. Moving forward against the impossible is not an emotional issue. It is a spiritual decision. You don't wait for fear to disappear to act. You decide to act in spite of it. Because fear will always exist, but it cannot be greater than your obedience. Every step Joshua took was a step of faith. Each challenge faced was an opportunity for God to manifest himself in a way that would only be possible in that scenario. The walls that seemed unbreakable were not a blockade. They were a stage prepared for a miracle. And this changes the way we see obstacles. What seems to be holding you back today may actually be the very place where God will show his power in your life. But for that, it is necessary to move forward. Not based on what you feel, not based on what you see, but based on what God has already spoken. Joshua had to choose to trust every day, even without visible guarantees, and it is this daily choice that builds a faith that does not give up. Because the impossible is not the end of the road. It is the beginning of something that only God can do. If you're here now, it's no coincidence. There is something being awakened within you, something that God wants to strengthen before the next step. Stick around until the end, because there is still one word that can change how you face all that is before you today. And while you begin to move forward even in the face of the impossible, there is another dimension of faith that often goes unnoticed, but that has the power to change entire destinies, the decisions you make when everything seems uncertain. Because it won't always be about facing giants or breaking through visible barriers. Sometimes it will be about choosing to stay when it would be easier to leave. And it is exactly in this kind of moment that Ruth's story reveals something profoundly transformative. Ruth was under no obligation to continue. Humanly speaking, it made more sense to return to your land, to what was known, to a more predictable life. She had lost, just like Naomi, and had before her an opportunity to start over away from that pain, but instead she made a choice that was not based on logic, but on conviction. Ruth 1:16 says, "Your people are my people, your God is my God." And this statement carries a level of delivery that goes beyond common understanding. She decided to stay by Naomi's side, even without guarantees, even without knowing what would come next. He abandoned his land, his culture, his past, all for a connection that seemed simple to human eyes, but which was aligned with something much greater in God's plans. And this is where many don't realize. Some silent decisions carry eternal consequences. Ruth's loyalty was not convenient. It was intentional. She chose to stay when she could leave. She chose to walk when she could stop. She chose to trust when everything was uncertain. And that stance reveals a powerful principle. God honors those who remain faithful, even when there is no immediate reward. Because faithfulness in difficult times reveals who you really are. It's easy to stay when everything is fine, when there's a return, when there's recognition. But when there is none of that, when everything seems empty, when there are no guarantees, this is where the decision gains spiritual weight. Ruth didn't know it, but her choice would position her in a lineage that would culminate in something much bigger than her own story. This shows that what you decide today can have a much greater impact than now. There are connections that God puts in the way. There are people, environments, decisions that seem ordinary but are part of something bigger being built. And abandoning in the middle can mean losing what has not even been revealed yet. Loyalty opens doors that no skill can open, because God doesn't move only by ability, He moves by heart. And when He finds someone willing to stay, to trust, not to give up, He begins to lead this person to places he would never reach alone. Maybe you're in a moment where it would be easier to retreat, give up, go back. But something inside you still insists on continuing. And this is not by chance. It could be God positioning you, aligning you, leading you to something that doesn't make sense now, but that one day will become clear. If this message found you in a special way, recognizing that God has been faithful even in the details, write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes a simple word carries a powerful statement of faith and can awaken others to see God's goodness in their own lives. And after understanding that loyalty can position you in places you never imagined, there is a moment when everything around you seems to have lost its life. It's no longer about fighting. It's no longer about waiting. It's about looking at an area of your life and feeling like there's nothing else to do, as if something had come to an end definitively. And it is exactly in this kind of scenario that Ezekiel's vision becomes so powerful and necessary. God leads Ezekiel into a valley full of dry bones. There was no movement. There was no sign of life. There was no natural hope. It was a scenario of total death, where anyone would look and conclude that there is no longer any possibility of change. And maybe you've felt this way at some point, looking at a situation and thinking that it's over, that there's no turning back, that there's nothing more to wait for. But God asks a question that changes everything. Can these bones live? And this question is not about logic, it is about faith. Because, humanly speaking, the answer would be no. But God does not work limited by what is visible. He sees beyond. He sees potential where no one else does. And then comes the word that carries transformative power. Ezekiel 37:5 says, Thus says the Lord God to these bones, Behold, I will bring the Spirit into you, and you shall live. Notice that before any change happens, God releases a word, because it all starts with what He says. The scenario does not change first. God's voice comes first, and this reveals something profound. Often, restoration does not begin with visible signs. It begins with a direction that needs to be obeyed. Ezekiel was instructed to prophesy, to speak to something that he apparently could not answer. And this seems strange, because it makes no sense to talk to something dead, waiting for a reaction. But that's exactly where the secret lies. Faith is not moved by what makes sense. It moves by the word of God. And when He obeys, something starts to happen. Bones come together, bodies are formed, and then the Spirit enters. This shows that the process can be gradual, but it begins the moment you respond to God's voice. The valley was not the end. It was the stage set for a miracle. That which seemed completely lost was still under God's control. And maybe today there is some area of your life that looks like this valley. Something that you once considered closed. Something that seems to have no solution. But this word shows that when God decides to intervene, nothing is really lost. The impossible is not a limit for Him. It is an opportunity to reveal His power. What He expects is not for you to understand everything, but for you to respond. That you believe even without signs, that you speak even without an answer, that you remain even without seeing immediate change. Because it is in this environment that the supernatural begins to take shape. This word is not for any time. If you're hearing it right now, it's because there's something God wants to touch inside of you. Stay until the end, because there is still something being prepared that can completely transform the way You see what seemed to have no more life. And after realizing that God can bring life where everything seemed dead, another kind of challenge arises that comes not from the absence of hope, but from the pressure around it. Because there are times when you know exactly what you believe, you know who God is, you know what the path is. But everything around you begins to pressure you to give in, to adapt, to give up principles that were previously non-negotiable. And it is exactly in this scenario that Daniel's life becomes a powerful reference. Daniel was not in a favorable environment. He lived in the midst of a system that not only ignored his faith, but tried to shape it according to completely opposite values. There was a constant pressure, silent at times, intense at others, trying to make him adjust, to bend, to be like everyone else. And that kind of pressure didn't go away over time. It continues to exist in different forms in the lives of many people. But what stands out about Daniel is not just what he faced, it's the way he positioned himself. When a decree was issued forbidding any prayer that was not directed to the king, Daniel had a clear choice before him: preserve his safety or remain faithful to God. And Daniel 6:10 reveals something that defines everything. Daniel, when he heard that the edict was signed, went into his house, and 3 times in the day he would kneel down and pray. He did not negotiate. He didn't adapt his faith to fit the pressure. He did not seek a middle ground to avoid consequences. He continued to do exactly what he had always done. This shows that true faithfulness does not depend on circumstances, it stands firm regardless of them. And this attitude comes at a price. Daniel's decision led him straight to the lion's den. Humanly speaking, this seemed like the end. It seemed that remaining faithful had cost too much. But this is where something profound happens. What seemed to be the consequence of defeat becomes the scene of a miracle. For God did not prevent Daniel from entering the pit, but went in with him. This reveals that standing firm does not mean the absence of challenges. It means God's presence in the midst of them. Daniel's integrity did not free him from the pressure, but it positioned him to live something supernatural. The grave was not the end of history. It was the place where God showed that faithfulness is never in vain. And maybe today you're feeling some kind of pressure, not necessarily visible, but internal, emotional, spiritual, a pressure to give up something, to give up principles, to give in areas you know you shouldn't. And this story makes it clear that it is exactly in these moments that his decision defines what comes next. Because pressure doesn't create who you are, it reveals it. And when someone decides to stand firm, even when it would be easier to give in, something is strengthened inside, something aligns, something is established unshakably. And it is this steadfastness that makes room for God to act in ways that go beyond the natural. And once you understand that standing firm in the face of pressure reveals who you really are, there comes a time when it's not enough to just resist. It is necessary to take a stand, because there are situations in which being silent is not neutrality. It is a choice that also has consequences. And it is exactly at this point that Esther's story becomes so current and necessary. Esther did not arrive at the place where she was by chance. She was placed in a position of influence, surrounded by power, in an environment that required care in every decision. Everything seemed stable, protected, until a threat arose against his people. And suddenly, what was once comfort turned into responsibility. Because now she had to decide, act and take risks, or shut up and preserve her own safety. And this decision was not simple. Speaking up could cost you your life. Remaining silent might seem safer. And that's exactly how many decisions appear, not as something obvious, but as an internal conflict between what is right and what is comfortable. Esther felt this weight. She understood the risk, but he also perceived something greater than fear. Esther 4:14 brings a question that echoes to this day. And who knows whether for such a time as this you have come into this kingdom? This question changes everything, because it reveals that her position was not a coincidence, it was purpose. And this is true for every person who at some point finds themselves in a place where they need to make an important decision. Perhaps you are where you are today, not just by circumstance but by assignment. God does not position people by chance. He places each one in strategic places at specific times to accomplish something that goes beyond the individual. And the most challenging thing is that many times this call involves risk. It is not comfortable, it is not easy, it is not safe to human eyes, but it is necessary. Esther understood that not acting was also a decision, and more than that, it could be the loss of an opportunity that would never return. So, even though she was afraid, she decided to take a stand. Not because she felt ready, but because she understood that the purpose was greater than the risk. This reveals a profound truth. It is not the absence of fear that defines courage. It is the decision to move forward in spite of it. God teaches you not to give up by awakening this awareness of purpose, showing that there are times when you need to get out of the position of observer and become an active part of what He is doing. Maybe there's something in your life right now asking for an answer, a decision that you have been postponing, a position that you know you need to take, but that still generates insecurity. And this story shows that the time to act doesn't always wait for you to feel fully prepared. It requires faith. And just as this message has reached you, there are other people who also need to be reached, perhaps even without realizing it. When you like, subscribe, and activate the bell, you help that word get to where it needs to go. And this is also a way of positioning yourself, of being part of something bigger, of allowing God to use your life as an instrument to play other stories. And after understanding that there are times when it is necessary to take a stand, even with fear, an even more challenging dimension of faith arises. Because there are situations in which God asks for something that simply does not make sense at the moment. There are no signs. There is no visible confirmation. There is nothing around that supports that direction. Just one word, and it is exactly in this scenario that the story of Noah reveals one of the deepest principles about not giving up. Noah was given an instruction that to anyone around him seemed completely absurd. God asked him to build a gigantic ark at a time when it had never rained. There was no reference, there was no history, there was no evidence that it would be necessary. It was just a divine direction confronting all human logic. And this is where many get stuck. Because obeying when everything makes sense is easy. But when God asks for something that can't be explained, that can't be justified in the eyes of others, that doesn't have support in what you see, that's where faith is really put to the test. Noah could have ignored it. He could have postponed it. He could have waited for a clearer sign. But he did something different. Genesis 6:22 says, "This is what Noah did. According to all that God commanded him, he did so." There is no recorded questioning. There is no negotiation. There is no attempt to adapt. He just started. And this reveals a powerful secret. The miracle does not begin when the rain falls. It begins when obedience is manifested. Each day, building that ark was an act of faith. Every hammer, every structure raised, every detail obeyed. All this happened in a scenario where nothing seemed to be changing. And perhaps the most difficult thing was not only the construction itself, but the constancy. Because obeying once is one thing, remaining obeying over time without seeing immediate results is quite another. Noah had to continue when no one understood, when he was perhaps questioned, when nothing indicated that it would make sense in the future. And this reveals something essential. True faith does not depend on external confirmation. It is based on what God has already said. Many want to see and then act, but God teaches us to act in order to reveal. The ark was built long before the rain came. And this shows that what you are doing today, even without signs, may be preparing you for something that has not yet happened. The process can seem silent, repetitive, even tiring. But it carries purpose, because when the moment comes, when what God has spoken begins to manifest, those who have remained obedient are ready, and those who waited for signs to start have already wasted too much time. God honors those who continue even without evidence, even without applause, even without guarantees. Maybe you're living just that right now, doing something that few understand, following a direction that has not yet shown clear results. But this story shows that what seems strange today may be exactly what will sustain you tomorrow, because when God speaks, time does not annul. He prepares. And after understanding that obedience needs to exist even without signs, there comes a moment when it is not enough to just do it in silence. It is necessary to raise our voices, because there are situations where the opportunity is passing, the moment is in front of you, and all you have to do is react. But along with this opportunity, there are also voices trying to silence you, to convince you that it's no use, that it's not for you, that it's better to accept the condition. And it is exactly in this scenario that the story of Bartimaeus reveals one of the most intense teachings about not giving up. Bartimaeus lived on the margins. He was blind, dependent, ignored by many, accustomed to a routine where almost nothing changed. He had no position, no influence, no prominence. But at a certain point, something different happened. He heard that Jesus was passing by, and this detail changes everything, because it wasn't a vision that awakened his faith. It was information. He listened. And sometimes that's how it all starts. Not with something visible, but with something you hear, something that ignites hope, something that awakens within you the possibility of change. And at that moment, Bartimaeus could have ignored it. He could have thought it wasn't for him. He could have let that moment pass like so many others. But he did the opposite. He began to cry out, and it wasn't a timid cry, it wasn't something discreet. It was intense. He was insistent. It was an attitude that broke the pattern of silence that they tried to impose on him, and as always happens, contrary voices emerged. People around him began to tell him to shut up, trying to prevent him from continuing. And this reveals something important. Whenever you decide to take a stand, whenever you approach something that can transform your life, there will be resistance. There will be voices trying to stop you, discourage you, get you back to the place you should never have left. But Bartimaeus did not stop. He did something even stronger. He shouted louder. This shows that true faith is not intimidated by opposition. It intensifies. It grows in the face of resistance. Because Bartimaeus' cry was not just a request, it was a spiritual position. It was the decision not to let that moment pass. And then something happens that completely changes the scenario. Mark 10:49 says, "And Jesus stood still and said, 'Call him.'" Among so many voices, among so many people, one cry stood out. Jesus stopped. This means that there is a kind of faith that draws God's attention in a special way. The miracle was not far away, was passing by him. But it was his attitude that made what was in motion stop. And this reveals that many times the answer is closer than it seems, but it requires a reaction, a boldness, a decision not to be silent. Maybe you've been silenced for too long. Maybe you've heard too many voices saying there's no point in trying anymore. But this story shows that there is still time, there is still opportunity, there is still an answer. A different position is enough. And if this message is speaking to you directly as if it were a call not to be silent anymore, write in the comments, "God takes care of me." Sometimes declaring this is the first step to break everything that has tried to limit you so far. And after understanding that there is a moment to cry out, to take a stand, and to break the silence, an even deeper point in the journey arrives. A place where there is no more crowd, no more recognition, no more apparent strength. A place where the biggest battle is not outside, but inside. And it is exactly in this scenario that Gethsemane reveals the most intense teaching about not giving up. Jesus knew what was coming. He was not facing something unknown. He was fully aware of the pain, the suffering, the rejection, and all that would happen. And that makes that moment even heavier, because often what paralyzes the most is not the suffering itself, but the anticipation of it. It's knowing what can happen and still need to continue. In the garden, Jesus turns away, prostrates himself and prays. There is no spectacle, there is no crowd, there is no applause. There is only a direct confrontation between the human will and the divine purpose. And it is at this moment that he expresses something that reveals the depth of this struggle. Luke 22:42 says, "Father, if you are willing, let this cup pass from me, yet not my will, but yours, be done." This statement shows that even Jesus, in his humanity, felt the weight of that moment. He didn't deny the pain, he didn't ignore what he was feeling, but he also did not allow this to define his decision. And here's one of the greatest secrets of spiritual perseverance. It's not about not feeling. It's about not surrendering to what you feel when it conflicts with what God wants to do. The surrender in Gethsemane was not weakness. It was the greatest show of strength, because letting go of your own will, when everything inside you wants another way, requires a level of trust that goes beyond understanding. It was there, in that silent moment, that the real victory began to be built. Before the cross, there was a decision. Before the physical pain, there was a spiritual surrender, and this reveals that the greatest achievements do not begin with what is visible, they begin with what is decided in secret. When someone chooses to trust God, even without understanding, something aligns in a profound way. Something is strengthened from the inside out. Often, people think that winning is avoiding suffering. It is running away from difficult situations. But Gethsemane shows that winning is often staying, trusting, saying yes when everything inside you means no. It is to align your will with God's, even without guarantees, even without full explanations. And maybe you're living in exactly that kind of moment right now. A point where there is an internal struggle, where decisions need to be made, where the human will conflicts with what you feel God is asking for. And this story shows that it is in this place that everything begins to change. What you will hear and experience from now on can touch exactly this area of your life. Stay until the end, because there is something being prepared that can become the answer you need so much, even if you have not yet fully realized it. And after understanding that surrender aligns the heart with God's purpose, a revelation emerges that completely changes the way we see pain, because there are situations that accompany the person for so long that they begin to seem part of their identity, limitations that did not start yesterday, but that have always been present, shaping thoughts, emotions, and even the way of living. And it is exactly at this point that the story of the man born blind brings one of the most profound answers about not giving up. That man knew no other reality. He didn't lose his sight at some point in his life. He was born without seeing. This means that he never had a reference of what it was like to see. He never experienced a change. He never experienced anything different. And around him there was a common thought. Someone should be blamed for that. It was easier to believe that that pain was the consequence of some mistake than to accept that there was something bigger behind it. But when Jesus enters the scene, he completely breaks that logic. John 9:3 says, "Neither he nor his fathers sinned, but it was so that the works of God might be made manifest in him." This answer changes everything, because it reveals that not all pain is punishment, nor is every limitation a consequence of failure. There are situations that carry a purpose that has not yet been revealed, and this directly confronts the way many people interpret what they experience. Because when the pain doesn't make sense, the tendency is to look for blame, to look for a quick explanation, to try to fit into something that relieves the discomfort. But the answer is not always in the past. Often, she is in what is yet to happen. That man's life was marked by years of limitation, but that didn't mean a lack of purpose. Rather, it meant that something was being prepared in silence. And at the right time, at the right meeting, everything changed. Jesus didn't just bring physical healing, he revealed an eternal principle. God turns seemingly unsolvable stories into testimonies that impact generations. The most interesting thing is that the miracle was not just seeing again. It was understanding that God never lost control, not even for an instant, even in the years of silence, even in the moments of doubt, even when everything seemed directionless. There was a purpose being built. This shows that what you see today as a limitation can hide a greater revelation, something that has not yet been understood, but that, in time, will make sense in a way that you do not imagine now. Suffering doesn't have to be the end of the story. It may be the beginning of something supernatural. Many give up because they misinterpret pain, but when spiritual understanding is activated, something changes inside. The vision adjusts, the heart is strengthened, and what once seemed like only weight begins to take on a new meaning. Because God doesn't work limited by what you see. It works beyond, far beyond what the mind can achieve. And after understanding that not all pain is purposeless, there is another even deeper point that needs to be confronted. Because there are situations where the problem is not just what happened to you, but how much you got used to it. And this is one of the most delicate areas of the spiritual journey, because prolonged pain can take root. It can shape thoughts. It can make someone believe that that condition is definitive. And it is exactly in this scenario that the story of the paralytic of Bethesda reveals something that few realize. That man had been in the same condition for 38 years. They weren't days. They weren't months. They were decades living the same reality. Stuck in the same place, always depending on something external to try to change their situation. He was at the edge of the tank, waiting for the waters to move, believing that this was his only chance. And over time, this wait ceased to be true hope and became a repetitive cycle. Because there is a difference between waiting and settling down, and often accommodation disguises itself as hope. The person is still there, in the same place, with the same speech, with the same expectation, but without a real decision to change. And it is at this point that Jesus approaches and asks a question that seems simple, but that carries enormous weight. John 5:6 says, "Do you want to be made whole?" This question is not about ability, it's about decision, because not everyone really wants to change. Some have become so accustomed to the condition that they can no longer imagine themselves outside of it. Pain became identity. The limitation has become part of the story that the person tells about himself. And that man's answer reveals just that. He doesn't answer directly. He presents justifications, explains why he can't, talks about the circumstances, the difficulties, as someone who is already conditioned to depend on external factors. But Jesus does not enter into this cycle. He doesn't point to the tank. He doesn't wait for the water to move. He releases a word. Arise, take up thy mat, and walk. This order goes beyond the physical. It is a call to break with a mentality built over years. Because getting up was not just getting out of that condition, it was abandoning everything that kept him trapped internally. It was to stop being someone who waits and become someone who responds. And at that moment, everything changes. Not because the environment has changed, but because there has been a decision. God breaks cycles when there is an internal response. when someone decides to leave the place where they have stayed for so long, even without guarantees, even without depending on the old conditions. This shows that the greatest miracle is not only the external change, it is the transformation of the mind. It is to stop seeing yourself as someone trapped and start positioning yourself as someone who can move forward. Because staying in the same place for so long can create a false identity. But an encounter with God redefines everything. And maybe, without realizing it, there is some area of your life where you have stayed too long. Not for lack of opportunity, but for lack of decision. And this word does not come to accuse, it comes to awaken. Because God keeps asking, not for lack of power, but because He wants to activate something inside of you. Before we move on, there is something important at this point. If there is something in your heart that needs intervention, something that you have already tried to change and still have not succeeded, write your prayer request in the comments. Put before God what has bound you. Because when there is unity in faith, something begins to move in a way that you cannot explain, but you can feel. And after realizing that change starts with an internal decision, there is an even deeper level that few people are willing to face. Because there are times when God doesn't just call you to change, He confronts you directly. It's no longer about what's around you. It's no longer about circumstances or people. It's about who you've become along the way. And it is exactly at this point that Jacob's story reveals one of the most intense processes of transformation. Jacob carried a history marked by human strategies, by attempts to control situations, by decisions that always sought advantage. He had already lived many things. He had already conquered. He had already advanced. But there was still something inside him that needed to be confronted. And then, at a turning point, he has an encounter that changes everything. During the night, Jacob gets into a fight, not a common struggle, not an external dispute, but a direct confrontation that crosses the physical and reaches the spiritual. And the most impactful thing is that this fight does not end quickly. It extends. It requires resistance. It requires persistence. And this reveals something important. There are processes that are not resolved immediately because they are not about circumstances, they are about transformation. Jacob could have given up. I could have let go. He could have retreated from the intensity of that moment, but he did the opposite. He remained. He held on. He decided that he would not leave the same way he entered. And this reveals a kind of faith that does not shrink in the face of discomfort, that does not run away when the process tightens, that does not give up when change begins to demand more. And then comes the defining moment. Genesis 32:28 says, "Your name will no longer be called Jacob but Israel, for as a prince you wrestled with God and with men and prevailed." The name changes. And this is not only symbolic, it is spiritual, because the name carries identity. And when God changes the name, He is saying that something within that person has been completely transformed. Jacob entered into that struggle being somebody and went out being another. The pain of that night left a physical mark, but it also marked his destiny forever. This shows that true transformation does not happen without confrontation. There are patterns that are only broken when someone decides to face it, when someone stands firm, when someone does not run away from the process. God was not trying to defeat Jacob, was transforming him. And this changes the way we see internal struggles, because not every battle is against something external. It is often a necessary confrontation to align who you are with what God wants to do in your life. And maybe there's something inside of you being confronted right now. Thoughts, attitudes, patterns that can no longer continue in the same way. And this discomfort is not by chance. It may be exactly the point where God is working to generate a new identity. Because in the end, God is not only interested in solving situations, He's interested in completely transforming you. And when this transformation happens, everything around begins to reflect this new level. And after understanding that God transforms identities through deep confrontations, a truth emerges that brings relief, but also responsibility, because the problem is not always only in what needs to be changed within you. Sometimes it is in the decisions you have made trying to escape from what God has asked of you. And it is exactly here that Jonah's story reveals something that many need to hear. Jonas was given clear direction. God spoke, showed the way, made evident what needed to be done. But instead of obeying, Jonah decided to go in the opposite direction. It wasn't a doubt, it wasn't a lack of understanding. It was a choice. He tried to run away from something that was already defined by God. And maybe at some point, you felt it too, when he knows what he needs to do, but still chooses another path, hoping that maybe things will fit in some way. But running away never solves, it only postpones, because God's purpose does not disappear when someone decides to ignore it. It continues to exist, it continues to be active, it continues to wait for an alignment. But this deviation has consequences. Jonah entered a path that led him to a storm, to a scenario of chaos that affected not only him, but everyone around him. And at a certain point, he finds himself thrown into the sea, and then inside the belly of a large fish. A dark, cramped, uncomfortable place where there were no distractions, nowhere to run. There was no longer any way to ignore what needed to be faced. And it is in this environment that something begins to change. Jonah 2:2 says, "In my distress I cried out to the Lord, and he answered me." Notice that the turning point was not the external environment, it was the internal decision. That's when Jonah stopped running away and started to line up. The belly of the fish was not only a place of discipline, it was a place of reconnection. A space where he had to face himself, recognize his condition, and decide to return. And this reveals something powerful. Giving up can delay the process, it can bring pain, it can generate consequences, but it does not cancel God's plan. The purpose still stands. God could have raised up someone else, could have followed in another way, but chose to restore Jonah. This is not an obligation, it is grace. The second chance is not something automatic, it is an opportunity that is born of mercy. And when it comes, it requires something essential: humility to recognize and willingness to obey. Because starting over is not just about going back to the starting point, it's about coming back differently, with an aligned heart, with a firm decision not to repeat the same mistake. God does not discard people, it redirects paths. And maybe you're at a point where you realize that you've moved away, that you've made decisions that have taken you away from what you should live. But this story shows that there is still a way back. There is still an opportunity to align, to start over, to continue. If this message touched you in a deep way, as a call to return, to adjust, to start over in a different way, write in the comments, "God chose me." Because recognizing this is the first step to living what He still wants to do in your life. And after understanding that God offers new chances even when we fail, a revelation emerges that breaks any human boundary about time and worthiness. Because there are people who believe that it has passed, that there is no more opportunity, that history has come too late to change. But it is exactly at this point that the scene of the cross reveals something that completely transforms this vision. Next to Jesus, there was a man who did not have a history of closeness to God. There were no records of good works. There was no lifelong path of faith, no time to rebuild all that had been lost. Humanly speaking, he was at the end. No future. No possibility, no time to change anything externally, but something happens at that moment. In the midst of pain, in the midst of judgment, in the midst of the end, he recognizes who is by his side. While others scoffed, while others did not notice, he saw something that many did not see. And then, with simplicity, but with depth, he makes a request. Luke 23:42-43 says, "And he said to Jesus, 'Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom.' And Jesus said to him, 'Truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise.'" This answer breaks any human logic, because there was no time for rituals. There was no time to correct the past. There was no time to prove anything. There was only a sincere acknowledgement, a genuine faith that was born at the last moment. But that was enough to access something eternal. This reveals that God is not limited to time as we are. What seems too late for man is still at the perfect time for God. And this brings a powerful truth. As long as there is life, there is opportunity. As long as there is consciousness, there is possibility of response. Giving up is never the answer when God is still calling. That man did not change his external situation, but his eternity was completely transformed. This shows that the greatest miracle is not just in what happens here, but in what is set beyond what the eye can see. Grace reached an unlikely place, at an unlikely time, in a way that no one could have foreseen. And maybe that speaks directly to you. Perhaps there is a feeling that it has passed, that there is no more time, that previous decisions have gone too far. But this story proves that no matter how far away someone is, a moment of sincere surrender can change everything. It's not about how much time you've had, it's about what you do with the moment you have now. Because God continues to look at the heart, continues to respond to true faith, continues to open paths where there seemed to be no other. Maybe you've been waiting for an answer for a long time, trying to understand if there's still hope, if there's still a possibility of change, and this message did not reach you by chance. Stay until the end, because something can still be revealed in a way that will touch exactly what you need to understand today. And after understanding that there is still hope, even in the last moments, a situation arises that everyone at some level faces: the unexpected storms. Because there are phases in which everything seems to be going well, where there is direction, there is purpose, there is even the presence of God. But suddenly the scenario changes. The wind picks up, the waves rise, and what seemed safe begins to sway intensely. And it is exactly at this point that the experience of the disciples on the boat reveals one of the most profound teachings about not giving up. They were not far from Jesus. On the contrary, they were with him. They had heard his words, seen his miracles, walked beside him. And yet, they found themselves in the middle of a storm that seemed too big. This already breaks a common idea. Being with God does not mean the absence of problems. Presence doesn't eliminate the storm, but it completely changes what it can do to you. What most worried the disciples was not only the wind or the waves, it was silence. Jesus was in the boat, but he was asleep, and this generated a type of despair that many know well. Because when difficulty comes, and it seems that God is not answering, the mind begins to question, the heart begins to restless, and faith is put to the test in an intense way. But Jesus' silence was not carelessness, it was total confidence in controlling the situation. He wasn't worried, he wasn't alert, he wasn't being taken by surprise. He simply knew that everything was under control. And this reveals something profound. The fact that God does not act immediately does not mean that he has lost control. When the disciples finally awaken him, Jesus stands up and does something simple but powerful. Mark 4:39 says, "And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Be still, be still.' And the wind was still, and there was a great calm." The storm that seemed uncontrollable submits to a word. This shows that what scares you is not out of God's reach, But before calming the sea, Jesus confronts something inside them, because the biggest problem was not the wind. It was the lack of confidence. They had Jesus in the boat, but they were still afraid. This reveals that closeness is not the same as faith. Being close does not mean trusting. And maybe that's the message you need to understand right now. True peace does not come from the absence of problems. It comes from the certainty that God is present even when everything seems out of control. The storm may continue for a while, but it does not define the end. If that word has come to you, there's a purpose in it. And if you are not yet part of this channel, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and allow more messages like this to continue strengthening your journey, because God still has a lot to speak to your heart. And after realizing that God's presence remains even in the midst of storms, an even deeper need arises. Learn to recognize when He is speaking, because it's not just about enduring the process, it's about understanding the direction within it. And it is exactly at this point that Samuel's story reveals something essential for those who want not to give up halfway. Samuel was still young when he began to hear a voice calling to him in the night. He wasn't distant, he wasn't lost. He was within the right environment, but he still didn't have enough discernment to understand what was happening. And this reveals something important. Being close to God does not automatically mean recognizing His voice. 3 times Samuel heard his name called, and all 3 times he ran to Eli, thinking he was the one who was speaking. This shows that, at first, God's voice may seem ordinary. It may blend with what we already know. It may not be as clear as we expect, and that is precisely why many end up ignoring or confusing. But there comes a time when everything starts to line up. Eli realizes what is happening and guides Samuel on how to respond. And then, when the voice comes again, Samuel says something that changes everything. 1 Samuel 3:10 states, "Speak, Lord, because your servant hears." This phrase is not just an answer. It is a position. It is the decision to be available, to listen carefully, to recognize that something greater is happening. This reveals that hearing God's voice is not something automatic. It is something that develops. It requires practice. It requires sensitivity. It requires humility to recognize that there are still things to learn. Samuel had to go through this process of discernment, of adjustment, of understanding. And that's exactly what paved the way for everything that would come after. Because when one learns to truly listen to God, one's life changes completely. Decisions start to have direction. Paths are no longer random. And even in difficult times, there is a different security. Not because everything is clear, but because there is trust in the one who is leading. God keeps speaking. He did not stop, He did not move away, He did not remain in permanent silence. But few are attentive enough to notice. Many give up because they do not understand what is happening, when in fact they are being called to develop this spiritual sensitivity. And maybe you're right now, hearing something, feeling something, noticing small signs, but still not fully clear. And that doesn't mean God isn't speaking. It could mean that you are learning to listen, because not every voice comes in an evident way at the beginning. But when there is willingness, when there is surrender, when there is an open heart, everything starts to make sense at the right time. And after learning to listen to God's voice, a new challenge arises that tests not only your sensitivity, but your constancy. Because listening to the direction is just the beginning. The real test is to stay in it when the oppositions begin, and it is exactly at this point that the story of Nehemiah reveals one of the most practical teachings about not giving up. Nehemiah was given a clear mission to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. It was a necessary, urgent work, loaded with spiritual and emotional significance. But along with the call, resistance also came. Criticism, threats, attempts at distraction, it all began to emerge as he advanced. And this reveals something important. When you start building something that comes from God, the path will hardly be smooth. Progress is annoying. The reconstruction draws attention. And often the biggest oppositions come not from within, but from outside. People trying to discredit, voices trying to confuse, situations trying to stop what is being raised. And the most dangerous thing is not the attack itself, it is the distraction it can cause. Because not all opposition comes directly. Some come disguised as an invitation, a conversation, something apparently harmless. And that's exactly what happened to Nehemiah. They tried to make him come down, stop what he was doing, get out of focus. But his answer reveals a clarity that few have. Nehemiah 6:3 says, "I am doing a great work so that I cannot come down." This phrase carries enormous strength because it shows that those who understand the purpose do not negotiate their attention. He does not get distracted by what does not add up. He does not stop because of external voices. He does not abandon the process because of pressure. Nehemiah knew what he was doing, and that was enough to keep him steady. Each stone placed on that wall was not just a physical construction, it was resistance. It was faith in action. It was proof that despite the difficulties, he would not stop. And this reveals that God's work in one's life requires constancy. It's not about starting with enthusiasm, it's about continuing even when obstacles arise. And maybe you're exactly in that kind of phase right now. You started something, made decisions, took important steps. But along with that came distractions, criticism, thoughts trying to make you stop. And this story shows that this is not a sign that you are on the wrong path. It can be just the opposite, because when there is purpose, there is resistance. But there is also strength available to continue. The secret is not to eliminate external voices. It is not to allow them to take the place of what God has already spoken. Whoever keeps the focus finishes the work. Few people will fully understand this message, but if you're here right now, there's something God wants to strengthen within you. Continue until the end, because there is still something that can adjust your vision and renew your strength to go on and on. And after understanding that remaining firm requires focus even in the midst of opposition, an even more challenging scenario arises. That moment when there seem to be no more resources, no more alternatives, no way out. It's not just hardship, it's real scarcity. It is looking around and realizing that what you have is not even enough to continue, let alone to move forward. And it is exactly in this kind of situation that the story of the widow of Zarephath reveals one of the deepest principles about not giving up. This woman was living on the edge. It was not an ordinary tightening phase. It was the end of resources. She had only a little flour and a little oil, enough to prepare one last meal for herself and her son. After that, there was no plan, there was no expectation, only emptiness. And maybe on some level you understand that kind of moment, when everything seems to have come to an end and there is no longer any logic to continue believing. But it is exactly at this point that God moves in a way that breaks all human logic. The prophet Elijah comes to her and asks for something that at first glance seems impossible, that she deliver precisely what would be her last provision. And here's the test, because when you have a lot, delivering seems easier, but when you have little or almost nothing, the decision takes on a completely different weight. And yet, that woman decides to trust. Not because it made sense, not because it was comfortable, but because it chose to believe in the word that was released. 1 Kings 17:14 says, "The flour in the pot will not run out, and the oil in the cruse will not fail." This promise was not accompanied by visible guarantees. It was accompanied by a decision that needed to be made. And then she acts, she delivers. And it is at this moment that the miracle begins. Not before, but after obedience. This reveals a principle that many ignore. God does not work based on the logic of accumulation, but on the logic of trust. The miracle is not anticipated to generate faith. It manifests itself as a response to faith. Scarcity, in that case, was not the end. It was a test. A point where her decision would define everything that would come after. And when she chose to trust, something supernatural happened. What seemed insufficient began to multiply. The little became continuous. The limit was broken. This shows that God's provision does not depend on the amount you have, but on the disposition of your heart. When there is surrender, when there is confidence, when there is a decision not to give up even at the limit, something begins to move beyond the natural. Maybe today you are looking at your reality and thinking that it is not enough, that there is no way to continue, that you have reached the limit. But this story reveals that it is precisely in this place that God begins to act differently. Because when it all seems to end, He still has a way of sustaining that doesn't depend on what you see. And after realizing that God can provide even when everything seems on edge, an even deeper revelation emerges. Because it is not just about receiving something from God, but about seeing who He really is. Because there are times when it is not the lack of resources that paralyzes, but the lack of spiritual vision. And it is exactly at this point that Isaiah's experience reveals one of the most transformative encounters anyone can have. Isaiah did not begin with a direct call. He began with a vision, a revelation so intense of God's presence that everything within him was confronted. He saw the glory, the holiness, the greatness. And in the face of this, something immediately happened. He perceived himself differently. Because when someone really has an encounter with God, they can't continue to see themselves in the same way. That sight did not bring immediate comfort. It brought awareness. Isaiah recognized his own condition, his limitations, his imperfections. And this is important because before it was sent, it had to be transformed. Before taking on any purpose, he had to go through an internal alignment. Because God does not call ready-made people. It transforms available people. And then, after this meeting, something changes in the environment. Isaiah 6:8 states, "After this I heard the voice of the Lord saying, 'Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?' And I said, 'Here I am, send me.'" Notice that the call was not imposed. God did not oblige, did not pressure, did not determine. He asked, and that question continues to echo to this day. Because God keeps looking for willing people, people who not only listen, but respond. People who not only feel, but take a stand. And Isaiah's answer didn't come from someone who knew everything, who had all the answers, who was completely prepared. It came from someone who had a real encounter and decided not to ignore it. This reveals that purpose is born of presence. It is not something that you encounter by your own effort. It is something that reveals itself when you truly draw closer to God. And when that happens, you can't remain indifferent. You can't stay in the same place. Something inside you begins to move, to want more, to seek more, to live something greater. And maybe what is missing is not strength, not resources, not opportunity. It is vision. It is to see beyond the natural. It is to realize what God is doing. It is to have an encounter that changes everything inside. Because when you see God for real, fear loses strength, doubt loses space, and purpose begins to take shape. And just as Isaiah answered, there is a question being asked silently within you, not with audible words, but with conviction. And the answer does not depend on perfection. It depends on mood. If this message is bringing clarity to something you've been feeling, don't let it go unnoticed. Write in the comments, "I trust in God's action," and allow that statement to further strengthen what is being awakened within you right now. And after understanding that purpose is born from a true encounter with God, an even higher dimension of faith emerges, that which does not depend on what is seen, nor on what is felt, but on what is spiritually recognized. Because there are times when God no longer asks for explanations, no more signs. He just expects you to trust the authority of what has already been said. And it is exactly at this point that the centurion's attitude reveals something rare and powerful. This man was not part of the people who accompanied Jesus. He didn't grow up listening to the promises. He wasn't inserted in the religious context of the time. But even so, he understood something that many who were close to him could not understand. He had a sick servant, a situation that needed urgent intervention, and he went to Jesus with a simple but conviction-laden request. And then he says something that completely surprises. Matthew 8:8 declares, "Lord, I am not worthy that you should come under my roof, but speak only one word, and my servant will be healed." This statement is not common, because most people, faced with a need, seek physical closeness, seek visible signs, seek something concrete to sustain the faith. But the centurion went beyond that. He understood authority. As someone who also lived under command and leadership, he recognized that Jesus did not need to be physically present to act. A word was enough. This reveals a level of faith that is not supported by emotions nor by circumstances, but in spiritual conviction. He didn't ask for proof, he didn't demand demonstrations, he just trusted, and that changes everything. Because many can only believe after seeing, after feeling, after having some kind of confirmation. But this man believed before any evidence. He did not trade his faith with what was around him. He stood on what he recognized within himself. God's authority is not limited by distance, condition, or setting. What he determines does not depend on the environment to happen. And when someone understands this, they begin to live differently, no longer attached to what he sees, but sustained by what he believes, no longer conditioned by circumstances, but aligned with the Word. This faith does not waver easily. It does not weaken in the face of silence. It does not shrink in the face of delay. She rests. He rests because he knows that God already has control of everything. And this does not mean the absence of challenges, but it means security in the midst of them. Maybe what God is calling you to now is not to see more, but to trust more. It is not to wait for a sign, but to recognize the authority of what he has already spoken. Because when that understanding settles within you, something changes completely. Anxiety loses strength, fear decreases, and faith begins to become firm, constant, unshakable. And it is at this level that the journey ceases to be based on circumstances and starts to be guided by a certainty that does not depend on what happens around you. Because when God speaks, it doesn't matter where you are. His word continues to have the power to transform any reality. And after understanding that true faith recognizes God's authority above all circumstances, there emerges an even deeper expression of this relationship, the surrender that doesn't need to make sense to anyone but God. Because there are times when what you do will not be understood, will not be approved, will not be valued by those around you. And it is exactly at this point that the attitude of Mary of Bethany reveals one of the most intense teachings about not giving up. Maria enters that environment with something extremely valuable in her hands. A rare, expensive perfume, something that could represent security, resource, even a guaranteed future. But instead of saving, instead of calculating, instead of rationalizing, she decides to spill it. John 12:3 says, "Then Mary took a pound of ointment of spikenard of great price and anointed the feet of Jesus." And this act goes far beyond something symbolic. It is a spiritual statement, because while many were still trying to understand who Jesus was, Mary had already discerned something deeper. She recognized the value of that moment. She understood that being there before him was more important than anything else she could keep in store. And that completely changes the perspective. But as always happens, true delivery attracts criticism. What she did was quickly questioned. People around began to judge, to point out, to say that it was an exaggeration, a waste, something meaningless. And this reveals a pattern that is repeated to this day. Those who live a deeper level of faith will not always be understood by those who still see only the superficial. And here's a turning point. Maria did not stop because of the external voices. She did not interrupt her delivery to justify herself, did not try to explain, did not seek approval. Because those who understand the value of God do not negotiate their surrender with the opinion of others. True worship does not need human validation. What seemed to many to be a loss, to God was precious. What seemed exaggerated was actually alignment. Because genuine surrender is not measured by human logic, but by spiritual discernment. It's not about how much it costs in the eyes of others. It's about what it stands before God. This reveals that there are times in your journey when you will be tested at exactly that point, to do what God has put in your heart, even without applause, even without understanding, even if you are questioned. And in those moments, giving up seems easier. But abiding is what reveals spiritual maturity. Mary didn't just pour a perfume. She poured understanding, surrender, priority. She showed that when someone recognizes who God really is, there is no calculation, there is no reserve, there is no fear of losing. There is only a willingness to deliver. And maybe God is calling you to a level like that, a level where you don't measure, you don't compare, you don't limit yourself by the opinion of others. A level where your surrender is guided by what you understand spiritually and not by what others think. Because it is in this place that faith ceases to be superficial and becomes something real, deep, and transformative. And after understanding that true self-giving does not depend on people's approval, an even more practical dimension of faith emerges. The one that manifests itself not only in moments of worship, but in everyday attitudes, especially when no one is looking. Because there is a tendency to associate spirituality only with great events, with remarkable experiences, with extraordinary moments. But Jesus reveals that many times the true spiritual path is in the silent decisions we make in the face of the pain of the other. The parable of the Good Samaritan begins with a common but meaningful scenario. A wounded man lying by the wayside, completely vulnerable, without strength, without resources, depending on someone who decided to stop. And the most impactful thing is not only his condition, but the reaction of those who went before. People who had knowledge, position, appearance of spirituality, but that they went on. This reveals something uncomfortable but necessary. It is possible to be close to religious practices and yet far from the heart of God, because the real test is not in what you know, but in what you do, and then someone unexpected appears. A Samaritan, someone who, in the eyes of society at the time, would not be the first choice to show compassion. Luke 10:33-34 says, "But a Samaritan who was on a journey came to him, and when he saw him, he was moved with compassion." This detail changes everything. He saw and felt it. He did not ignore, he did not deviate, he did not find justifications to move forward. He interrupted his journey. And this is important, because often the purpose does not appear as something planned, it appears in the middle of the way. The Samaritan didn't just feel compassion, he acted. He took care of the wounds, put the man to safety, invested time, resources, energy. No guarantee of return, no recognition, no obligation. This reveals that true compassion is not just a feeling, it is a decision. And here's a profound teaching about not giving up. Because helping someone, caring, getting involved with the pain of the other, it also requires perseverance. It requires getting out of one's own world, one's own worries, to see beyond. And many times, it's easier to move on, to pretend you didn't see it, to keep the focus only on yourself. But that's exactly where the purpose is lost. God teaches not to give up by awakening a sensitive heart, because when someone becomes indifferent, they begin to disconnect from the essence of what God wants to do. Compassion is a living expression of God's presence. It is through it that love ceases to be theory and becomes practice. Maybe you're looking for answers, direction, something deeper. And this message shows that many times what you're looking for is also in the way you respond to the people around you. Because ignoring others can mean missing opportunities to live what God has prepared. In the next few moments, something even deeper will be revealed, something that can adjust your way of seeing your own journey. Continue to the end, because there is a connection that you have yet to fully understand. And after understanding that love in action reveals the true spiritual path, a truth emerges that completely changes the course of any story. The decision to seek, even when everything seems to play against it. Because there are times when transformation does not begin with a visible miracle, but with a simple, almost imperceptible movement that reveals something deep within the heart. And it is exactly at this point that the story of Zacchaeus becomes so powerful. Zacchaeus was not well regarded. He carried rejection, judgments, a reputation that distanced him from people and placed him on the margins of any positive recognition. He had resources, he had a position, but he lacked something that none of this could fill. And perhaps this is one of the greatest illusions, to think that what is external can solve what is internal. But at a certain moment, something inside him moves. He hears that Jesus is passing by and decides he needs to see it. It wasn't an elaborate plan. It wasn't a complex strategy. It was a decision. But there were obstacles. The crowd, the physical limitation, the look of people. Everything seemed to make that access difficult. And this is exactly where many give up. But Zacchaeus did something different. He did not get caught up in limitations. He was not intimidated by judgments. He did not let the scenario define his attitude. He ran and climbed a tree, a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. Because that movement revealed something that no one could see from the outside, a real spiritual hunger. And when there is this sincere search, something happens. Jesus stops. In the midst of so many people, in the midst of the crowd, he looks at exactly who has decided to take a stand. And then comes the word that changes everything. Luke 19:9 says, "Today salvation has come to this house." It wasn't a long process. It wasn't something distant. It was immediate. This shows that true transformation begins with the decision. Before any external change, something needs to happen inside. Zacchaeus not only wanted to see Jesus, he moved to it. And this movement made room for an encounter that completely redefined his life. The most impactful thing is that the change was not just for the moment. It manifested itself in attitudes. He decided to give back, adjust, transform his way of living. This reveals that when someone truly encounters Jesus, they do not remain the same. The change is not superficial. It is visible. It is practical. It is real. God continues to respond to those who sincerely seek him. It doesn't matter the past. It doesn't matter what is behind it. It doesn't matter how people see it. When there is a decision, there is transformation. And often, what is missing is not opportunity. It is a movement. Perhaps all God expects is that first step. Not perfect, not complete, but sincere. Because that's when something starts to align, something starts to change, something starts to gain direction. And what seemed far away suddenly becomes present in a way that changes everything inside. And after understanding that transformation begins with a sincere decision to seek, one of the most profound revelations about God's heart emerges. Because it is not just a matter of going to Him for the first time, but of coming back after having gone away. And it is exactly at this point that the parable of the prodigal son reveals something that breaks any idea of definitive rejection. This son did not leave by chance. He made choices. He decided to follow his own path, sought independence, wanted to live without limits, without direction. At first, everything seemed to make sense. It seemed like freedom. But over time, the consequences began to appear. What seemed like abundance became scarcity. What seemed like pleasure turned into emptiness. And this is an important point, because often the departure does not happen abruptly. It starts with small decisions, with paths that seem harmless, but that little by little distance themselves from what really sustains. And when he realizes where he has arrived, the reality is already different. He is alone, without resources, without direction, in a place he never imagined he would be. But it is exactly in this background that something begins to change. He recognizes his condition. It doesn't try to justify. It doesn't try to blame. It doesn't try to hide. He understands, and this recognition is the beginning of everything. Because as long as someone does not see, there is no change. But when awareness arrives, the decision can be born, and then he decides to go back. Not with pride, not with demands, but with humility, willing even not to be received in the same way, willing to start over anyway. And it is at this moment that the most powerful scene happens. Luke 15:20 says, "And he arose and went to his father. And while he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and was moved with compassion." His father did not wait for him to arrive completely. He did not stay away. He did not demand explanations before acting. He saw it from afar. And he ran. This reveals something profound about God. He is not waiting for perfection to receive you. He is ready to restore as soon as he notices a return movement. And more than receiving, the Father restores. He doesn't treat him like someone rejected. He doesn't keep his distance. He doesn't remember mistakes. It gives back dignity, identity, position. This shows that the return is not only accepted, it is celebrated. God teaches not to give up by showing that there is always a way back. No matter how far someone has drifted away, no matter what decisions have been made, no matter how much time has passed, when there is a sincere movement of return, there is a response. And perhaps this is the most important message so far. Because staying away is also a choice, but so is coming back. And God is still in the same place, with the same heart, with the same willingness to restore completely. What seems to be the end may just be the point of return. Because when someone decides to return, they discover that they have never been beyond the reach of grace. And after understanding that there is always a way back to God, a dimension emerges that many ignore, but which is essential to remain steadfast. Because it is not enough just to return, it is necessary to stay. And staying most of the time does not happen alone. It is exactly at this point that the early church reveals a powerful secret about not giving up. The early Christians lived in a scenario of constant pressure. There was persecution, rejection, threats. Following that path was not comfortable, it was not safe, it was not easy. And yet they remained, but not because they were stronger individually, but because they were connected. Acts 2:44 says, "All who believed were together and had all things in common." This expression goes beyond physical proximity. It reveals unity, commitment, mutual care. They did not live in isolation. They did not face difficulties alone. They did not carry their weights in silence. There was a collective force that sustained each one, and this completely changes the dynamics of the spiritual journey. Because there is a tendency to try to face everything alone. keeping, supporting, dealing internally without sharing. But isolation weakens. It distorts thoughts, amplifies fears, creates an environment where giving up seems closer. Communion, on the other hand, does the opposite. It strengthens, encourages, brings clarity, sustains when individual strength begins to fail. The early church didn't grow just because of miracles. It grew because there was unity. People who walked together, who supported each other, who shared not only resources but faith, and that generated something powerful, a resistance that could not be broken easily. God teaches not to give up also through people, through words at the right time, unexpected support, connections that seem simple but that carry purpose, because no one was called to live this journey alone. There is a force that is only manifested when there is true communion. And perhaps without realizing it, one of the reasons why everything seems more difficult is precisely the lack of this connection. Not for lack of faith, not for lack of will, but because it is trying to sustain something that was designed to be lived together. Communion is not just a detail. It is a spiritual strategy. It is an environment where faith is renewed, where hope is strengthened, where giving up loses space. Because when someone weakens, the other sustains. When one doubts, the other remembers. When one thinks about stopping, the other encourages them to continue. And this reveals that standing firm does not depend only on your strength. It also depends on who is walking with you. Because the right connection may be exactly what God will use to keep you on your feet. At the end of this video, something even deeper will be released, something that can strengthen your faith in a way you may never have experienced. Stay until the end, because that moment can mark a new level in your walk with God. And after understanding that the journey was not made to be lived alone, a revelation emerges that sustains everything that has been built so far. Because it's not just about resisting, continuing, or standing firm, but knowing where all of this is going. Because when someone loses sight of the end, they start to get lost along the way. And it is exactly at this point that the revelation of revelation brings one of the greatest reasons to never give up. Life often feels like a sequence of battles, difficult moments, situations that don't make sense, pain that seems to repeat itself. And if the gaze is only stuck on the now, everything can seem too heavy. But God, in His wisdom, has not only left instructions for the way, He revealed the ending. Revelation 21:4 declares, "And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death, nor mourning, nor outcry." This promise is not only symbolic, it is definitive. It shows that there is a point where all pain will be ended, where everything that weighs today will cease to exist, where suffering will no longer have space. This completely changes the way you walk, because the present struggles cease to be the center and become part of the process. They do not define the destiny. They do not determine the end. They do not have the final word. There is something greater prepared, something that has already been established by God. And here is one of the deepest secrets of perseverance. True hope lies not in what is happening now, but in what God has already secured. When someone understands this, the way of facing difficulties changes. Discouragement loses strength, fear decreases, and faith begins to take hold of something that cannot be shaken. The revelation of the end strengthens the present. Because those who know where they are going are not easily lost. Even when the path seems difficult, even when the answers are not immediate, there is a certainty sustaining everything. Victory is not a possibility, it's a promise. And this does not mean the absence of struggles, but it means security in the midst of them, because everything that happens now is temporary. But what God has prepared is eternal. And this awareness changes priorities, changes decisions, changes the way of living. Many give up because they look only at the now. But those who keep their eyes on the promise continue. He is still tired. He continues even without fully understanding. He continues because he knows that there is something greater being built beyond what can be seen. Spiritual victory has already been established for those who remain. It's not about being perfect. It's not about never failing. It's about not stopping. It's about keeping believing, even when everything around you tries to tell you otherwise. And if this word came to you as a confirmation, as something that brought clarity and direction to what you are experiencing, do not ignore this moment. He writes in the comments, "I believe, Lord." Because sometimes a simple statement of faith is what strengthens the heart to continue to the end. Everything that has been revealed so far points to a truth that can no longer be ignored. It is not enough to understand, it is necessary to respond. Because there comes a time when continuing to listen without taking a stand becomes a silent way of staying in the same place. And if there's one thing this journey has shown, it's that God doesn't just observe. He calls, He invites, He draws near. The ultimate promise is not just about what's to come, but about who's with you now. In the midst of all that has been experienced, there is an available, accessible, real presence. Psalm 34:18 declares, "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted." That means it doesn't matter how you got here. If there is sincerity, if there is openness, He is already near. And perhaps this is the most important moment of this whole journey. Not because something new will be presented, but because now everything depends on your answer. God spoke through stories, examples, truths, but now He speaks directly to your heart. It's no longer about learning, it's about delivering. It's no longer about understanding, it's about trusting. There is an invitation being made right now, an invitation to put aside the weight, the doubts, the fears, and simply place yourself before God with truth. Now, in silence or in words, open your heart. Let's pray together, trusting that He is in control, that He listens, that He answers, and that nothing that has been experienced so far has been in vain. Because this is the time to align everything, to surrender everything, and to allow God to do what only He can do. Beloved Father, your word reminds us that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And it is in this truth that we place ourselves now with open hearts, recognizing that we need your presence more than ever. Lord, we thank you for all that has been lived so far, for each teaching, for each word that has deeply touched the soul, for each moment in which the Lord spoke in a silent but powerful way. Thank you because even when we don't realize it, the Lord has been guiding, sustaining, and bringing us to this very moment. Now, Father, we cry out for strength. It strengthens those who are tired, who no longer know how to continue, who feel the weight of daily battles. It renews the spirit, rekindles faith, brings a new perspective to those who thought about giving up. It gives wisdom to make decisions, direction to those who feel lost, clarity to those who are confused. Teach us to trust you even when we don't understand, to stand firm even when we don't see immediate results. Lord, visit now every area of the lives of those who are praying. It touches wounded emotions, heals pains that no one sees, restores broken hearts. It enters homes bringing peace, reconciliation, and love. It releases provision for those facing financial difficulties, opens doors where there seemed to be no way out. Stretch out thy hands upon the sick, bringing healing, relief, and complete restoration. May all anxiety, fear, and oppression be removed now by the force of your power. At this moment, in silence, each one presents before you what is kept in the depths of the heart. Needs, dreams, worries, and requests that only the Lord knows. Receive, Father, every sincere cry that is being made now. We commit everything into your hands. We surrender the past with its pains and mistakes. We surrender the present with its challenges and uncertainties. And we place the future before you, trusting that the Lord is already there. May your will prevail in our lives, because we know that your plans are perfect and greater than ours. Father, at the end of this prayer, may each heart feel your peace, the one that surpasses all understanding, guarding the mind and the spirit. May a new force be released, may a new hope begin to be born, and may no one leave here the same way they entered. We declare that we will not give up, because the Lord is with us at all times. In Jesus' name we pray with faith and trust. Amen. If this prayer spoke to you, write in the comments, Amen, and declare that faith about your life today. After all that has been revealed here, one thing is impossible to ignore. God has never taught you to give up. He has always taught you to keep going, even when everything seems difficult. Every story, every teaching, every word you heard was not by chance. This message is for you. God has chosen you to hear this today because He knows exactly what you are facing right now. Maybe no one around you understands. Maybe you've thought about stopping, but there's something bigger being built inside of you. The question that remains is simple but profound. Will you continue to trust, even without seeing everything being resolved yet? I am very happy to know that we are together on this journey of faith, for real. You are not here by chance. You are part of something bigger. And I want to walk with you in this. So if this message spoke to your heart, leave your like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet, because this helps this word to reach more people who also need it. But I want to go beyond that. Comment below where you are watching, and if you feel in your heart, share a little of what you are experiencing. It can be a struggle, a testimony, or even a prayer request. We are in this together, and your story matters, both to God and to everyone who is here. And look, it doesn't end here. In fact, this is just the beginning of something much bigger. In the next video, we'll dive even deeper into how to live that faith on a daily basis, how to hear God more clearly, and how to stand firm even when everything tries to stop you. There's a next level to this journey, and it's closer than you think. Don't miss that, because it may be just the missing piece for you to understand what God is doing in your life right now. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here, because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater, and His presence is our strength. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life, and see you in the next video.